All right, folks, today we're dealing with the last section in Revelation chapter 12. So we hope to complete Revelation chapter 12 this afternoon. You remember Revelation chapter 12 consists of 3 acts. Verses 1 to 6 is act number 1. It takes us from the birth of the child right through to his ascension and the woman fleeing into the wilderness. And then last week we looked at act number 2, and act number 2 was dealing with the war in heaven, laying the foundation for us to understand why the woman in verse 6 was fleeing into the wilderness. And what we do today is we pick up the story at Revelation chapter 12 and verse 13. And when the dragon saw he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. And so this is connecting the Act 2 to Act number 1 and Act number 3. Pursued, this word pursued, as we have discussed already, went in pursuit of, began to pursue, sometimes translated he persecuted. He persecuted or tried to make trouble for. But the Greek, if you look at the Greek word that underlies this, it really adds drama to the whole story, because it means to aggressively chase. So it's not just he's going after, pursuing her, but he's aggressively chasing her. He's like a hunter pursuing its catch or its prey. And so in other words, the picture in Revelation 13 is that the dragon's aggressively hunting the woman down. He's hunting her down. That's what the word pursued means. Earnestly desiring to overtake her and to apprehend her. What's in his mind? Destruction. Destruction of the woman. Only by implication can it be translated to persecute. So the basic idea is he's on the hunt. He's chasing her down in order to destroy her. And in verse 14, the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness. We've done this already in verse 4 and verse 6. Yes? Just repeating. Verse 6. He's picking up the story again now. Stopped it at verse 6. Verse 7 jumped to heaven to get us to the point to understand why the woman was fleeing to the wilderness. And now in verse 14 he's about to pick the story up and to continue it on from that point onwards.
On verse 13 now, where it says, and now when the dragon saw that he had been cast down to the earth, does that mean that he can no longer go back into the heaven?
That's what it means, but we'll deal with that. I think we'll deal with it today. No, we should have dealt with it last week. It's in your notes from last week. Just check that. Yeah, it means he no longer can stand before God openly accusing God's people as he had been during the previous time. Yeah, thank you. So the woman given 2 wings of a great eagle, she might fly from the serpent to the wilderness, to the place where she's to be nourished for time, times, and half a time. And this is a reference back to the days of Elijah. So there's a reference there in chapter 12 with the time, times, and half a time, which is equivalent of 1260 days. Okay? It's a reference back to Elijah. Okay. Now verse 15. The imagery from verse 15 and verse 16 and verse 17 is actually being drawn from Palestine. And we'll see that in a few minutes. But in verse 15, the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. So there you've got the dragon, and he's chasing after the woman. He's actively hunting her down. and suddenly he opens his mouth and his sides contract and he vomits. And the picture that John saw was he vomits out this great wall of water that sweeps across the earth towards the woman, because he's going to sweep her away with a flood. Sweep her away with a flood. Now, this imagery comes out of Palestine. It comes out of Palestine. Wet season in Palestine occurred after the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month. So the Feast of Tabernacles, pouring out of water, was a prayer to God for the early rains to come. This is around about October, November. And so the rains would start October, November, and they will continue on through December, very heavy in December, January, February. And then they would begin in February to tail off to get back to the dry season. But I want you to understand just a couple of things about the wet season and the dry season. This is a topographical map of Palestine. The rains, the winds that carry the rains come from the west. They come from the Mediterranean Ocean, yeah? Because across this side, we've got desert. So when the winds came from the east, they were dry and they parched the land. But during the wet season, the winds would be coming from the west and they'd be carrying moisture laden here. Now, this area here is in the rain shadow. It's like when I was in Papua New Guinea and you've got Pacific Adventist University, and at certain times of the year we get the dry season, and honestly it got so dry that the ground would just crack open. And that was because there was mountains right around that area, and so the water in the clouds would be dropped on the mountains and it wouldn't penetrate down into PAU and the surrounding area. And so here, the rains would hit the highlands, the mountains, and they'd drop their moisture there on the mountain tops. Now, during the wet season, when the rains are dropping on the mountain tops, it begins to run down the sides of the hills. You get small streams becoming larger bodies of water, until finally right down in the valleys near the Dead Sea, you'd get these massive walls of water suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Hey, I was looking up for some pictures of this to illustrate, and just last year 12 young teenagers were taken out by their school to walk in one of these areas, good for hiking, in the valleys where there was no rain at all, no water at all, and suddenly flash floods, because the rains occurred up there in the mountains, and suddenly as it trickles down the side and gathers in momentum, you get these massive walls of water suddenly occurring in the valleys. Remember the story Jesus told of the two houses? One was built on the sand and the other one built on the rocks. The ones built on the sand were built on the dry riverbeds. The ones that were built on the rocks are built up here on the sides. And he was a foolish man to build there, because he must have known what would happen during the wet season, because the rains fell and the winds blew, and suddenly the waters came, and the man who had built in the valley had his house washed away. Well, young people lost their lives. Now look at this. This is desert. It's not raining in the desert. It's raining up there in the highlands, but suddenly the water's just cascading down and you get these walls of water. This is what it's normally like. And so these young people were taking a walk up one of these valleys, wadis, and suddenly raining up in the highlands. And suddenly a great wall of water confronted them. They're caught here, nowhere to go, And they're swept away and they're drowned. And so this is where the picture's coming from. You see, it's coming out of Palestine and the weather. And so what John is seeing is a dragon vomiting out a wall of water, sweeping down as a woman's fleeing into this wilderness area in order to sweep her away and to drown her and destroy her. We'll come back to this and interpret it in a few minutes. Are we all right on this? It's just understanding the root of the imagery. Now, verse 16 says, the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. And so suddenly now, between the woman and the wall of water, a great chasm opens in the earth, and the water pours down, and the woman is now freed on the other side. This comes from the Old Testament. It comes from the Old Testament. There's a dragon, opened his mouth, great wall of water, the woman's over here, coming after the woman, suddenly the earth cracks open, and the water flows down, and the woman is delivered. Numbers 16, 30 to 33. Almost exactly the same words here. This is a story of Korah and the sons of Reuben who rebelled against God in the wilderness. And Moses said, if the Lord creates a new thing and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up, see, same words as in Revelation, all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, then you'll understand that these men have rejected the Lord. And so there we've got in the Old Testament Moses saying, look, if God does this, you'll know that God is against them. So this is going to be the deciding point. And then in the next few verses, now it came to pass as he finished speaking all these words, the ground split apart under them. Earthquakes. The ground splits apart. But it's not swallowing up people in Revelation. What's it swallowing up? It's swallowing up the flood. It's delivering God's people during a time of persecution. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their household and all the men with Korah, with all their goods. And so they and all those with them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed up over them. So I'm just saying there's imagery there in Revelation chapter 12 that's coming out of the wilderness experience. Interesting, isn't it? Wilderness experience. And in Revelation chapter 16, what have we got? Wilderness experience for God's church. Huh? Okay. And Deuteronomy 11:6 is another one where it talks about the earth opening its mouth and swallowing them up. It's referring to basically the same incident. And so that imagery is coming out of history and the situation in Palestine. Now we come to verse 17. We're just getting the storyline straight here. The dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And we come to that last section. And then it says, he stood on the sand of the sea. Now, I think we might have touched on this before, did we? Yeah, it rang a bell, but we'll just quickly go back through it. The dragon, we pointed out the dragon and the woman. Where were they? Here. They're in the wilderness, aren't they? Huh? And so this is where the conflict with the woman takes place. But then it goes and says, and the dragon went off. He's leaving the wilderness. And where's he going to? He's going to, basically good, he's going to the seaside, and there you've seen that diagram basically before. This is the wilderness area basically in here, wilderness of Judea. This is the hill country. This is the wilderness area in there. And the dragon's left the wilderness and he's gone across to the sands of the sea. He's gone across to the beach, to the side of the Mediterranean Ocean. We all right on this?
I like that.
Yeah, okay. And then why did he go there? We go into chapter 13, the story continues. I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, and so he's joined there on the beach. The dragon's joined by the first beast, and then in chapter 13, 11 and 12 he sees another beast coming up out of the earth, and so there on the beach he's calling the beast from the sea and the beast from the land, and they're joining him there on the beach because they are getting ready to do what?
War.
To make war on the
Offspring.
remnant, on the offspring, remnant. Okay. And so that's going to become important next week when we start to move into chapter 13, keeping this in mind. And so there's your diagram. You've seen that before. The dragon standing on the beach. First beast comes out of the sea. He's joined by a second beast that comes out of the land. The dragon meets with his earthly accomplices to prepare for war on the rest of the woman's offspring. Now keep in mind, this in mind, that Revelation is perhaps the best book in the whole of the Bible for saying when it comes to life here on this planet, we've got to keep in mind that there are two dimensions. There's the spiritual dimension, and there is the material or the earthly. This would be the heavenly, and this would be the earthly. And so in the spiritual realm, we have the dragon with his angels. We're clear on that, huh? This is what we're seeing in Revelation chapter 12. And he's pursuing the woman who's on earth. But Revelation chapter 13 is saying that the dragon on earth works through accomplices. You following this? He works through the first beast and the second beast, the one that comes out of the sea and the one that comes out of the land. These are the earthly counterparts of spiritual forces in heavenly places. And we'll be looking next week, starting this coming week, we'll be looking at the identity of the sea beast, and then we'll look at his activities, and then we'll look at the second beast, his identity, and then we'll move into his activities. And so we'll spend a bit of time on Revelation chapter 13. We all right on this? Because we've got another counterpart to this too, and that is, I'll just do it over here. We've got, in spiritual places, we've got the lamb, and in the earthly dimension we've got the woman, and then we've got the rest of her offspring. The rest of her offspring. So you can see the counterparts, huh? And so war between the dragon and the lamb is reflected on earth through the war between these and the woman and her offspring. We've got to keep that tension always in mind. We'll be spending time looking at these, but always we've got to keep in mind that they are part of an unholy trinity. The heavenly with the earthly counterparts, and the heavenly with the earthly counterparts. Are we okay on this? Okay, because this is the perspective that Revelation's trying to build up for us. So as we move deeper into Revelation, this becomes clearer and clearer. The only other place where we get this view of conflict in heavenly places with its counterpart on earth would be in Daniel chapter 10. In Daniel 10. So Daniel 10 just briefly introduces it, but Revelation fills it full. Fills it full. Okay. Now, I just want to outline these verses because we're going to interpret them. We're going to understand what verses 13 through to 17 are talking about. So verse 13 and 14, as we've seen, the dragon aggressively pursues the woman. Yes? He's hunting her down. And so she's fleeing from him into the wilderness for time, times, and dividing of a time. The dragon sends a flood after the woman who's in the wilderness in an attempt to destroy her. But verse 16, the earth helps the woman escape the flood, and the dragon, angry that the woman's escaped, goes off to make war on the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. Yeah. We'll deal with that later. We'll deal with that much, much, much later, but we will deal with it. Okay, so these are the key points. Like we outlined verses 1 to 6, we're outlining, summarizing and outlining the last few verses. Are we all right on this? It's fairly straightforward. It's in your notes too. It's in your notes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pick up the symbols. We've identified the symbols, outlined and identified the symbols, and then we're going to interpret them. And most of these we've already done. Yeah? For example, the dragon, you should know this by now, symbol for Satan, and you should be able to pick up those two verses references, 12:9 and 22. And then the woman, we've identified her as a symbol for the church. So this is a living symbol because it was commonly understood in the first century by all Christians that the woman's being used both in the Old Testament and in New Testament writings as a symbol for the church. And the wilderness, what's that? It's a place of refuge during persecution. That's the imagery associated with it. Time, times, and half a time we've already looked at, equivalent to 1260 days. Yes, day for a year, that will become 1260 year period. Allusion to the protective care of Elijah by God during the persecution by Ahab and Jezebel. And so that's what we get out of this. God is looking after his people, protecting them, feeding them during this time of persecution. Prophetic days represent years. Numbers 14:34, Ezekiel 4:6. We've covered this already, so we're going fairly quickly through it. 3 new symbols introduced. The earth. I'm going to discuss this when we come to Revelation chapter 13, 11 to 18, because that will help us to more clearly understand it. The rest of her offspring, I'm going to identify those in the latest in a later study. We'll talk about them as the rest of her offspring now, but we're not going to try and identify them. And folks, the reason for that is Revelation 12 fits with Revelation 13, fits with Revelation 14, and once you see the parallels and how they're connected, you can go to chapter 12 and get information on the rest of her offspring. You can go to chapter 13 and get information, and you can go to chapter 14 and get information, and then you put it all together and it paints the full picture. We always want to shoot off as soon as we see the remnant of a seed. We want to get straight into who is it. But you don't fire your gun until it's fully loaded. You understand that? Okay, so we'll deal with chapter 12. We'll deal with chapter 13. We'll connect it with Revelation chapter 14. And then we will put all the passages that deal with the remnant together. And that's when we will deal with the identity of the remnant. So at the moment, we just rest in the fact that right at the end, the remnant of her seed are the ones who will suffer that persecution. Are we all right on this? Okay, so you know what we're doing. So all we've got to really look at is the flood. And in your notes, I've more than adequately covered it. Consistently in the Old Testament, the invasion of the land of Judah by the armies of invading forces is likened to the surging waters of a river in flood. So whenever the Babylonians coming down and invading Judah, they're likened to a flood. Whenever the Assyrians coming down and invading Judah, they're likened to a flood. And so flood's got that picture of invasion, of invading armies. I'll give you a few texts. Isaiah 59:19. So shall they fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. So from east to west. When the enemy comes in like what?
Flood.
A flood. See? Enemy, flood. Connected. The Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard against him. And so when God's people, God's land is being invaded by the enemies like a flood, then the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard against him and protect. Here's another one, Daniel 9:26. And the people of the prince, remember this is the 70-year prophecy? 70 weeks, I'm sorry. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city. Jesus is referring to this in Matthew chapter 24. Huh?
Yeah.
This is the prophecy. Shall destroy the city, that's Jerusalem, AD 70. And the sanctuary, AD 70. Its end shall come, now note the next words, its end shall come with what?
War.
With a flood.
Oh.
With a flood, no, you're okay, and to the end there shall be war. So what's the flood? It's the people of the prince, the armies of the Romans who invade AD 66 to AD 70 Jerusalem. And so you've got that same imagery of a flood as a symbol for invasion, armies and warfare. We okay on this? This is how Jesus knew what to say in Matthew chapter 24, because he knew the prophecies of the Old Testament. He's simply taking the prophecy from Daniel chapter 9 and he's applying it to its fulfillment, which is going to come after his time, because it's after the coming of the Messiah that the prince of the people who will come, people of the prince who will come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so Jesus knew, after my death and my burial and resurrection, this is what's going to happen. And here, remember he talks in Matthew 24 of the abomination that maketh desolate. Notice the word? Desolations. So, no surprises. Jesus was a student of Scripture. So it's not that he's suddenly getting everything coming in visions, because he's God, he knows everything. He's depending, like we do, on the Old Testament for his facts. Jeremiah 47:2. Thus says the Lord, behold, waters will arise out of the north, and shall be what? An overflowing flood. You remember up to the north of Palestine, just get this cleaned up. right up to the north up here you've got the river Euphrates, yeah? The northern boundary of the land that God had promised to the children of Israel. Across the other side was Mesopotamia. This is where the Assyrians and the Babylonians came from. And so they're pictured as they crossed that river, they're pictured like waters of a river in flood, you see, because they're flooding out over their boundaries and they're flooding into the land. And so this is the imagery. Behold, waters rise out of the north. They would understand this. And it shall be with an overflowing flood. They shall overflow what? The land and all that's in it, and the city and those who dwell within. Then men shall cry, and all the inhabitants of the land shall wail. And so there's the picture of invasions from the northern empires coming in and flooding over the land to the south of the river Euphrates. So invasion by armies. And so now we come back to this. Can you make sense of it? Okay. So how would you understand this? We just do simple substitution. So what do we understand? Verse 13 and 14. The dragon aggressively pursues the woman. What does it mean? Yes, Satan is aggressively pursuing the church, who flees into the wilderness, that is into a place of refuge, because that's what the wilderness was, a place of refuge and protection from invasion for times and dividing of a time, and you understand that, 1260 days, 1260 years, and it's got the picture behind it of the Elijah experience, yeah? So you understand the verse. That's simple, isn't it?
So the 1260 year from which year to which year?
538 to 1798. Check your notes. It should be in your first one. Okay. The dragon, what does he do? The dragon sends flood after woman. Who's the dragon? Satan. The woman? The church. And floods represent? Armies. So he's sending invading armies after the church. But then the earth, and we said we'll leave this until we come to Revelation chapter 13 to 18, 11 to 18. The earth helps the church escape from the armies, the floods from the armies. And then Satan, angry that the woman had escaped, goes to make war on the rest of her offspring. So this is right at the end, the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. Only 2 points mentioned there. There's about 5 or 6 major points scattered through chapter 12, 13 and 14, which we'll uncover as we go through. And so that's the story in verses 13 to 17. Are you finding it fairly easy?
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's not complicated. This is what I want you just to get to the point where you can approach those verses, read them, outline them, identify the symbols, interpret them, and then substitute back in, and you've got the message. You've got the message. Are we okay?
Yes.
And so now, just to finish off, I want to have an overview of Revelation chapter 12. Just the big picture of what we've actually covered. Oh, here we've done this already. I didn't put it up, but we've done it here. So that's those verses basically interpreted. Getting back to your question, here, the 1260 years, which is the 3.5 times, that's the same as the little horn in Daniel chapter 725. It's the dark age, basically the dark age period. And if you're wanting details on this, go into Great Controversy and read about the Waldenses and Albigenses. That will just give you some insights. They're not the only example, but they are an example of this. Okay. Now, this is Revelation chapter 12. What have we seen on chapter 12 of Revelation as we go back? 3 weeks it's taken us, 3 sessions. We're coming to the end of it. So we're just summarising. What have we seen in chapter 12?
Three stages.
We've seen 3 stages, and it's really covering the history of the church from the time of Jesus, first advent. Agreed? Because the woman waiting for the birth of the child born, caught up to God. So it's extending from the time of Jesus right down through to the time of the end, that final great conflict. And so it's covering the history of the church between the first and second comings. We okay on this? And it's saying that during that time, the dragon's going to make 2 great, concerted, concentrated, focused attempts to wipe God's church off the face of the earth. And the first of these is the first major persecution with the woman in the wilderness for 1260 years, times and half a time. And that's in verses 6 and verse 14. We okay on that, huh? Okay. And then it moves on in the next part. This is up to verse 6, and from verse 13 on to 17. And it says, once this first persecution is past, the dragon's failed. He's failed. 3 times he's failed. He failed to destroy the child. He failed in his war in heaven. And he's failed in his attempt to destroy the woman. And what the rest of Revelation is going to say is he's failed, he's going to fail in his attempt on the remnant. So big F, that's him. He's the big F, the 4 Fs. Strike 1, strike 2, strike 3, but he's got a strike 4, so he's definitely out. That's why he'll be swimming at the end in a lake of fire. And if you want an F grade, that's where you're going to end up too with him, you see. So be careful you align yourself on the right side. Now, right at the end in verse 17, the second persecution, the war on the rest of her offspring. So if anyone says to you, what's this chapter 12 all about? Just say, oh, look, it's covering the period of the history of the church from the first to the second coming. And it's telling us that during this time, Satan's going to make 2 great attempts to destroy God's church. The first one, verse 6 and 14, war on the remnant. And the second one, right at the end, the first one, war on the woman. And the second one, war on the remnant. Are we okay on this? Now, let me just put this in a broader perspective for you, just to finish. And this is not in your notes. It's not in your notes, but it's coming out of what we covered in those first 10 weeks. Because that material's always there, and it's coming into focus all the time in Revelation. You remember Revelation is elaborating on Matthew chapter 24. You remember this? Okay, now, Matthew 24, remember the preliminary signs of the second coming? Followed by tribulation time, followed by the signs of the second coming. Okay, so that's verses 4 to 8. This is verse 9 to 28. And this is verse 29 to 31. We okay on this? All right. Now what we did is we lined this up with the seals. Remember that? And we saw that the seals are seals 1 to 4, covering the preliminary signs. 6th seal, seal 6, covering the imminent advent, and then comes the 7th seal, which is going beyond Matthew 24. But what did we find with the 5th seal? Remember? 5th seal, time for revision, time for a test. Okay, what did we find? Tribulation time, here, Matthew 9, 9 to 28, is covered in the fifth seal. Remember the souls under the altar crying out how long? And so this fifth seal is elaborating on the tribulation time. But then we went on and we connected this to the trumpets and the bowls and the last visions. Do you remember that? Okay, so the fifth seal is covered in the trumpets. And the trumpets are going from chapter 8 through to chapter 14. You've got it all in your notes. I'm hoping by now it will be in your heart and in your heads. But the trumpets are covering the tribulation time. We okay on this? And now we're into Revelation chapter 12. That's part of the trumpet section. Yes? It's dealing with tribulation time. And it's giving structure to the tribulation time. And it's saying the tribulation time in Matthew 24 consists of two great periods of persecution. Are you following this? Two great periods. So Revelation chapter 12 and chapter 13 are giving structure to Matthew chapter 24. Are we okay on this? So now, if people say to you, where do we stand in the stream of history? You could go to Matthew 24 and say, oh, we're in the tribulation time. But if you go to chapter 12 of Revelation, you can say, well, where are we? First persecution is over. The second period of persecution lies ahead. So that's where we are. We're in that time when one is finished and the other one is yet to come. Are you following, huh? This gives us structure. Any time during the history of the church, God's people could use Revelation chapter 12. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servant must soon take place. And so the church here, right up in the early stages, could look ahead and say, well, this is what we are, man, ahead of us. We've got this great period of persecution that's going to last 60 years. Any Christians living during this time who understood Revelation chapter 12 could say, this is what we're in. And they'd gain strength from the assurance that God gives them that they're in his hands. He's going to nourish them. He's going to protect them. He's going to look after them. And those living in between, they know where they're standing because they see what lies behind and they know what lies ahead. So this is practical. You understand that, huh? It's practical for us because it tells us where we are in the stream of history. And honestly, folks, we're moving closer and closer to this. But that's not to be discouraged because the closer we move to this, it's the closer we move to the second coming. And so we should be looking forward and praying for the second period of persecution to start. Because the sooner you get it through, the better. It's like going to a dentist. You know, you got pain in your teeth and you go in there and you fear and trembling as you go into the dentist and sit in the chair. But then he gives it a yank and out it comes and then whew, the relief.
Look around parts of the world, it probably already has started. Much in New Zealand.
Let's hold off on that because chapter 13 is going to start to fill out this fuller. You follow? So this is just the seed. In chapter 13 and chapter 14 and chapter 15 and 16, we're going to get now this period beginning to be expanded with more details. And it's when you get the big picture from Revelation that it will stop you from jumping to false conclusions on where we're standing in Earth's history. Are we okay? All right, so that's it for today. I hope I'll see you next week, and we'll deal with Revelation chapter 13, show how it connects to chapter 12, and then we'll deal with the identity, how you can prove the identity of the first beast. And then the week after, will deal with the activities of the second beast. You know, deadly wounds, being healed, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll move on to the second beast, its identity, and then we'll move on to its activities. And that's when you'll start to get more details on that period between the two persecutions. All right, folks, let's bow our heads for prayer. Father, we thank you again for the opportunity we have had to study Revelation and for the clarity that comes to us. And we pray, Lord, that you'll help us to build it into our lives in a very, very practical way, that we might be ready to speak to those around us and give them an answer for the hope that is within us. We thank you for Revelation. We thank you for the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus, and we thank you for the assurance, Lord, that you love us, you care for us, that even as today we're in your hands, so will we be when it comes to that second time of persecution. So bless us each one during the week as we continue, Lord, to prepare ourselves for your advent, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.